Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Vertical Space, a podcast at the intersection of technology and flight. We are your hosts, Jim Barry and Luka Tomjanovic, and here we look at the most important forces shaping the market of advanced air mobility, with a particular focus on why and how they matter to those building a business in this very exciting and growing industry.
When the technology is applied to the drone, you really have to prove that it's going to work. So, for example, part of any kind of package for beyond visual line of sight would be how you're going to communicate with the aircraft. And if something goes wrong, how you're going to tell it what to do. And so there's awesome C2 solutions out there. There's great stuff that occupies 5G and 4G and has fallback to SATCOM. But you have to have a lot of documentation to prove that that's going to work and that process and procedure is not only in place, but effective and it's been tested and you know how it's going to function. And I think that's where most operators fall short in trying to get to this beyond visual line of sight world.
Welcome back to The Vertical Space. The conversation that follows is with Justin Steinke, Senior Vice President of Commercial Business at Spright. As a senior executive of one of the more sophisticated drone operators in the market, Justin knows the drone industry inside and out. He is just as comfortable discussing macro industry trends as he is getting into the weeds of enabling technologies. Needless to say, we did both. We start with a long discussion on the state of the commercial drone market, the remaining unaddressed pain points, technology gaps, enterprise adoption, upcoming market inflection points, the regulatory situation, and among other things, the best practices employed by successful drone businesses. Throughout the conversation, you'll hear Justin highlight the importance of bringing aviation expertise and mindset as a prerequisite of success and how this is still a rare find in the industry. We also touched on the relative pros and cons of B2B and B2C drone delivery business models in terms of time to market and ease of proving a safety case. And before taking a dive into the medical delivery use case, Justin shared what the Part 107 BVLOS waiver process looks like and what went into their 300-page submission to the FAA. And as we talked about the medical delivery use case, Justin went into a much appreciated level of detail describing the ConOps, all the associated elements, value proposition for hospitals and communities, and other operational and product details that are often overlooked in these conversations. Towards the end of the episode, we also talked about UTM, detect and avoid technologies, drone type certification process, operational approvals, and of course, advice to entrepreneurs who are considering entering the drone market. As mentioned, Justin is the Senior Vice President of Commercial Business at Spright, where he's focused on delivering scalable unmanned solutions into medical use cases, as well as providing turnkey inspection services to electric utilities. With 20 years of aviation experience and startup leadership, Justin is highly experienced in system design, manufacturing, analytics solutions, and communication systems for the DoD and UAS industries. Prior to Spright, Justin led the team at Volair, GE Aviation Eros, Data into Knowledge, and Simulize across engineering, product management, and strategic business development. Justin holds a Bachelor of Science degree in aviation technology and finance and is a commercial rated pilot and former flight instructor. Enjoy the conversation with Justin after a short sponsor message. This episode of the Vertical Space podcast is brought to you by uAvionics. uAvionics is the leader in low size, weight, and power certified avionics for manned, unmanned, and advanced air mobility aircraft. Let uAvionics help you achieve your goals, whether that be type certification, airspace access, or beyond visual line of sight operations. uAvionics has certified and certifiable communications, navigation, and surveillance avionics for your aircraft. So head over to uavionics.com or Google it to see how you can start flying safer and move your platform forward into shared airspace. Justin, welcome to the Vertical Space. I've been looking forward to this conversation, so thank you very much for being on our podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually an avid listener, so this is a real treat.
Thank you very much. All right, so first question we typically ask, is there anything that very few in the industry agree with you on?
That's a good question. You're going to start with the hard ones. I think the one thing that I probably get a lot of flack for saying is that, the technology is really not quite there yet. I think, I've been in the space for about 10 years now, and I started really on the DoD side of things, helping integrate drones into the military space and then moving into the commercial side of it. And 10 years ago, everybody thought there was going to be a million drones out there, and there's just not. And part of the reason is that 10 years ago, we thought the technology was really close, and it wasn't even near where it is today. And the hardest part of all of that is that, the technology from a tech perspective, from a Silicon Valley perspective, is there. So I can go buy all these components and I can put them into a drone and I can put that drone in the air and it looks great. The harder part of that is all of the documentation and all the reliability information, all the things that really need to be in place to support the regulatory body letting this aircraft operate. So, when I say the technology is not really there, it's just really not at the same level of maturity that you would expect from traditional aviation. And I think whether people want to believe it or not, that's one of the biggest challenges that the industry faces, is really kind of getting to that next tier of mature solutions to actually put on these aircraft and make them fly.
That's an interesting observation, because typically people would say that technology is there. It's the regulatory aspect that is the issue. Hopefully we'll unpack this in the conversation. Staying at a high level first, how would you describe the current state of the drone market as it relates to enterprise adoption and, as you mentioned, technological maturity?
Yeah, I think it's in a really interesting place right now. So I would go as far to say that we're really at a point of inflection where we're at a tipping point where there's a lot of potential for this to take off and go the direction everybody's really wanted. The technology has matured over the last several years. The operators have matured, and that's been kind of the most important part. There was a real sense of build it and they will come with drone manufacturers over the last 10 years. And now we're starting to see operators like Spright that have come to the table and really try to remain aircraft agnostic and want to take this from an aviation level and start applying it to different business cases. So I think one of the things that's really been challenging this industry as a whole is that you've got a lot of tech companies that want to be aviation companies. And, one of the things that makes Spright unique, just to kind of pitch ourselves for a second, is that we're an aviation company that's starting to use drones. And that approach is just very different when it comes to the regulators and understanding what the regulators want and getting access to what you need to make it successful and understanding the business case and how to, have a positive EBITDA at the end of the road. And I think that makes a substantial difference.
So for those who are not aware of Air Methods and Spright, do you mind giving a high-level overview?
Sure. Yeah. So Spright's a wholly owned subsidiary of Air Methods. Air Methods is one of the largest air ambulance operators in the world. I've got about 470 some odd aircraft, around 300 plus bases around the US. This originally started when we started looking at how drones might service that community. So you can imagine one of the biggest challenges with both drones and the AAM space is that there's nowhere to land for a lot of reasons. And so when we looked at, we've got 300 plus bases, we could use those as a platform to operate drones from. What could we do with the drone? And that's really kind of what set this in motion, is to start exploring what those different service areas are. Air Methods, if you know anything about their business, 99% of what's carried is people. So moving people from scenes to a hospital or inter-hospital transfers or babies from facilities to facilities. So it's all people. So when you start exploring what else could aviation carry and move, you start getting into supply chains and access to care and some of the things that are actually really interesting. And so that's what Spright was really built upon. And today we do not only the medical side, but we're also on the critical infrastructure utility side of things. We've got amazing drone technology that actually flies power lines and takes all the images and does all the vegetation management and does it in a super effective way that really rivals the traditional helicopter methodology that's traditionally been somewhat unsafe over the years. So that's really what our business has turned into over the last 18 months or so.
Very interesting. Okay, so let's unpack your opening remarks a little bit. Regulation is often quoted as the reason for a lower than expected commercial drone adoption among enterprises. And if we rewind back to 2016, we've seen a big inflection point when Part 107 rules came out. And now everyone seems to be pointing to BVLOS rulemaking, or that will be called Part 108 or something else, as the next big unlock. But you also claim that technology is not mature enough. So you're in the industry. What is it that makes you convinced that the technology is not there yet?
I think at the root of everything, and you can actually take this from a worldwide perspective. So if you look at EASA and some of the areas that have been very progressive with drone integration into the airspace, at the end of the day, whether it's the FAA or another regulatory body, it's all about proving that you can do something safely. And so if you look at the traditional waiver process and the exemption process, there are CONOPS and mitigations to risks and other considerations that go into that whole process and procedure. And being able to come to the regulator and say, I want to be able to fly beyond visual line of sight, and here's what I want to do, and here's why it's safe, I think has been difficult for the industry to wrap its head around. And I think there's a lot of truth in the waiver process from days prior. A lot of waivers were denied from the FAA early on because people didn't know what to put in them. And then the FAA did a good job of educating the community on here's really what we're looking for. And now there's a lot of waiver guidelines and templates you can use from the FAA's website. And we're still kind of at that same inflection point when it comes to beyond visual line of sight. So I want to be able to operate 20 miles between these two facilities, just let me do that. And I think that's one of the challenges that, something like a 108 is going to have is how do you account for, the independent variables for all of these different use cases. And it's most likely going to end up being a very similar approach where I am going to have to look at the routes and I'm going to have to look at what the different risks are along that route and who the different stakeholders are and how many aircraft I have that I can't account for and be able to prove that I can still do this in a safe manner. And that's really the same process, whether it's the FAA or it's the EASA SORA process. I imagine that's still going to have some impact on the scalability of that. And to kind of come full circle and answer your question, when the technology is applied to the drone, you really have to prove that it's going to work. So, for example, part of any kind of package for beyond visual line of sight would be how you're going to communicate with the aircraft. And if something goes wrong, how you're going to tell it what to do. And so there's awesome C2 solutions out there. There's great stuff that occupies 5G and 4G and has fallback to SATCOM. But you have to have a lot of documentation to prove that that's going to work and that process and procedure is not only in place, but effective and it's been tested and you know how it's going to function. And I think that's where most operators fall short in trying to get to this beyond visual line of sight world.
And why do they fall short, Justin? Is it because they lack the expertise or because there is uncertainty as to how this needs to be achieved, how this level of safety should be demonstrated in the first place?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that in all fairness, there's not a whole lot of people out there sharing information about how this can be done. Those companies who have successfully accomplished it don't share. And so that becomes really challenging for anybody to be able to leverage success and make your own. I think in addition to that, you also have the complexity of it's still new technology. So there's not a ton of data. If you look at anything, historically in aviation, it takes 10 to 15 years to start doing something different or to use a new technology. I think, the FAA for some time had benchmarks of 20 years for some of the bigger transitions they made. That's a lot different than, we've got this really cool new widget that is fantastic and it needs to be deployed next year. So there's just a lot of data to be collected on, reliability and durability. And that's why the DNR process has been so key to things like type cert.
If you consider this concern around not having potentially enough empirical data to define certain standards for the industry go prove the safety case against, how do we break this chicken and egg problem?
It's a good question. And I think there's a couple of ways to really look at this. One is people need to do more of it, right? So the number of beyond visual line of sight waivers that aren't really short distance and aren't using traditional multicopters is pretty small. So there's still a lot of pioneering being done on being able to fly beyond visual line of sight and do that effectively. I think there's great examples of it. I think that Zipline and Wing and others who are in the news that have really shown how effective their systems can be are doing a great job leading the way. And I think you just need more of that. You need a lot more scale, and we're hoping to add to that puddle and will be this year as well. But I think it's going to come down to volume.
So how are innovative companies successful in navigating the current industry landscape, and how are they accumulating this flight heritage? What are some of the best practices?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, the answer is pretty simple. I mean, you have to have people who come from an aviation background. You have to understand, it's a lot like policy. There's a lot of rules in the drone space that most operators know and understand. But knowing where they come from is probably more important, how we got to where we are today and why it is written the way it's written. And this goes for everything in aviation. You start looking at building software. I get asked the question all the time, like, how are you going to certify the software? There's standards that have been around for a very long time for this. So you have to be able to leverage the traditional aviation approach to everything and understand what was successful in the past and how you can apply that to today's world and start there. They may come out with new rules to make life a little easier and don't have to go down those traditional paths. But until then, you really have to lean on what we've done in the past and how you can use it in the space of drones.
And as an operator, what are some of the still remaining unaddressed market pain points?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, there's a couple of big ones, and these are both great rabbit holes that we can dive down if you want to. But, scalability, BVLOS right now is still, every single flight path has to be addressed, and you have to understand the risks of those. So it's not like in Europe where you've got the ability to, if you've got the right authorization, self-certify routes based on, minimum standard for each one of them. We're still very much in every single route is its own thing. And that can be cumbersome. So, although there is a waiver process and an exemption process, you might have dozens of waivers to be able to do what you want to do. And that is time consuming and heavy. I think the other side of it is that there's definitely still technology that has to be addressed in terms of how you integrate drones into the airspace. There's still participants of the airspace that are not reporting, they're not transmitting anything, they're not talking to anybody. I know there's still a small percentage of aircraft out there that still don't have an electrical system. So you still have these non-cooperatives, and detect and avoid is still going to be an issue for some time. I don't think there's ever going to be a silver bullet where you put this camera on and everything's good to go forever. But I think a layered approach to that is probably going to be the easiest solution to doing that full integration. But I would say between scalability and detect and avoid, those would be the two largest hurdles that we have to get through.
Can we hover a little bit on both of these points? And
Sure.
If you don't mind, peel a couple of layers off on this BVLOS waiver process and what exactly is involved in getting in front of the FAA and presenting a safety case for a BVLOS route?
Yeah, it's a complex process. I think we just did a BVLOS flight last year in Kansas. It was about 30 miles, which is a long route. And you basically have to assess everything. You have to look at, the aircraft, the systems that are on the aircraft, how those systems operate, how as an operator you interact with those systems. So you go through everything from how the pilot controls the aircraft to how the pilots and other pilots or observers communicate and what kind of systems they're communicating on and how they don't step on each other, and full duplex radios. You got to look at the airspace and evaluate every stakeholder that's in there. So from a high level, it's still the same air risk and ground risk analysis. But when you really start breaking down all the different pieces of that, you do find a lot of complex parts of the operation. And as I mentioned, I think our waiver was, 200 or 300 pages when it was finally done. So it's not a simple process.
Wow.
But at the end of the day, if you really want to go and do something at that length, you really have to account for all the different scenarios, all the different people who might be there. And I'm sure you're going to kind of branch into this, but when you're flying 30 miles, there are people who are not transmitting. So it's not like we can just put an ADS-B receiver out and see all the traffic. We can't. So we have to know who the stakeholders are, and we have to communicate with them. So
And how long did it take to get that waiver?
It was a few months. Few months to get that done. And fortunately, we had what I consider a pretty good package. So the RFIs or the requests for information that came back were pretty light, and that was helpful. But we'd been down this road before, so we knew kind of what to put in and what to expect and how to approach it.
When you consider the entire process and the entire safety case that you presented, the air risk, the ground risk, what parts of it were relatively easy to address and show, and what were some of the most difficult ones?
I think it's pretty easy to look at the airspace. It's pretty easy to figure out who's there and how you might communicate with them. There's a lot of ag operations, for example, in Kansas, and so we have to know who those operators are and how we're going to communicate with them when we're flying, and if they decide that they need to take off real quick, how they communicate with us. So that stuff is fairly standard and been industry practice for a long time. I think once you hit BVLOS and you start having more complex systems, that's when things get complicated. So if you look at just communication links as an example, you have to really answer the question of how the technology works. So a lot of our systems operate on the cellular network. And so we do quite a bit of analysis on the cell network. What can we expect? Which networks are available? We use a great company that's got a great piece of hardware where we actually have multiple networks on it. So we can have up to 4 cellular networks on it. And then it has a fallback onto SATCOM. So that's all great. And it's really easy to kind of put the marketing talking points up on the waiver form. But at the end of the day, what they're really looking at is, how do I know that it's going to fall back to cellular or to the SATCOM? And if it does go back to SATCOM, what can the SATCOM be used for? Because most SATCOM is bandwidth constrained. So those are the things that start getting more complex. And again, kind of back to my previous point, although our C2 provider is very good, a lot of these great technologies don't have a lot of great documentation on that stuff. So you end up creating a lot of it as you go.
And is this something that you do once and then you can recycle and reuse for additional routes? Or, alternatively, if you have to do this for every single route, at what point can you aggregate all of those routes and start thinking about an area of operation for BVLOS rather than just individual routes?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a couple ways to look at that. So there's definitely great examples of people who have been able to build up and start small and have lots and lots of routes. Wing's a good example of this right now. They're doing a great job of it. I think, from our perspective, there are definitely bits and pieces of that waiver application that can be reused, about the company and the use case and the aircraft and the systems and how the systems work. That's all hopefully reusable. What's always harder is the air risk and ground risk specific to that flight area. So that's the part that has to get looked at and evaluated. And I suppose eventually there'll be a process where we might be able to self-certify stuff on more of a blanket waiver. But I have a feeling the FAA is probably not going to give that up very quickly. It's going to be a hard thing to get your hands on if you want to be able to do longer BVLOS routes kind of at your own will. I think kind of one differentiation here that's important is that, when you look at the medical space, the distances we need to fly are quite long. So it's often that we're at 20 or 30 miles before the business case makes sense. And so getting a BVLOS waiver for a couple miles and doing that in even a blanket fashion is probably going to be relatively straightforward for a while. Being able to do that over a longer distance is going to continue to be hard. And I imagine that that's not going to be a blanket waiver anytime soon.
With your medical use case, your medical applications, and you're more B2B than you are B2C. Does that impact at all what we're talking about here with BVLOS?
We certainly think it does, which is a bit self-serving. But, at the end of the day, I think there's a couple of interesting advantages to the B2B side that, may or may not be overlooked from a regulatory perspective. But if you look at, we'll call it the noise of the drone space, initially the drone world started with a lot of toys, right? And that was kind of the first thing that was strange. So you had a lot of toy drones, and the volume was not in commercial operations. It was in people who got these things for Christmas and now had 10,000 of them out in practice. On the commercial side, there's just not that same level of volume. And what kind of blossomed next is, all of the big companies that are doing the B2C work. So you started to see people who, wanted to get to your house and deliver you something. And again, all of that is great. I always say to everybody, and I'll caveat this conversation with this point, we hope that everybody's successful. There's not enough operators competing with us right now. I hope we have more. I really do, because that'll help move the needle. There's enough market for a lot of people. But in that case, the B2C is complex. You've got other considerations that are really hard to solve for, like what will the community think of this? And is the community always going to be receptive? And, if I look at one route versus, an entire, suburb that I want to deliver to, which is, potentially thousands of routes, it's an order of magnitude more complex in terms of how you evaluate that. And there's ways of doing it, and people have been successful accomplishing that. But my point is really that when you look at the B2B space, it can really be approached differently because I've got a fixed route. And once I've figured out my route and I've accomplished, looking at the different risk areas, and I've avoided all the places I don't want to fly over, that route's pretty much fixed, and we know where we're going to fly, and I know what the risks are, and I know what's there and what's not there. I can integrate with the local groups, and I can make sure that we're coordinated, and I can build that rapport. And, from our perspective, that's a much easier thing to tackle because it's just fixed and easy, as opposed to being able to kind of deliver anywhere within a certain region, which has a lot of caveats to it.
Justin, how do you ensure that you have enough flexibility to ensure a level of service to your customers that they expect? If everything is fixed, and let's say you have an approval for one single route, BB route that you're going back and forth on, things happen in life, right? There's either weather events or construction or, probably 100 different things that we can go down the list of why you might need to reroute or take another path. What happens in those situations then? Are you grounded or do you have alternative routes? And then if the latter, then how is that different from having a broader area of operations versus a route?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, certainly this is an area that we think a lot about and we spend a lot of time on. So at the end of the day, initially what we're moving is blood samples, and people need to get the samples to the lab. Long term, there's lots of growth opportunity and potential for other things to move between those facilities. But if you've got a blood sample that needs to move from one place to the next, it's not necessarily an emergency, although there are cases of that. But it definitely needs to get there, right? So we can't have issues where it doesn't get there. And that service uptime that you're referencing is really important to our business and our use case and our contracts, if you will. I think that our approach to this is very similar to the way we look at our aircraft, right? So you've got aircraft that have redundant systems, and you've got operations that have redundant ways to make sure that that particular package gets to where it needs to go. So fortunately, again, because the volume we're talking about is much less than hundreds of flights a day on a B2C side, it's not hard for our ground personnel to make that delivery. And so if there is a weather event or there is something else prohibiting us from flying, we can still complete that mission and make sure that package is delivered.
And long term, how do you ensure that there's scalability in the BB loss process so that you do have the flexibility of routing as the situation on the ground and in the air demands? What are either some of the technology opportunities or, quite frankly, process changes that need to happen before we see this reality?
I think as much beef as the FAA gets on the type cert process, and we can certainly talk about that too. At the end of the day, the DNR approach to this, the durability and reliability approach to it, is really the right approach. And this is what will change our business too, is that the systems will get better, they'll last longer, we'll have less failures, we'll have better data to support things before there's a failure. And all that's just going to take time. And so I think that the short answer to your question is that time is what provides the biggest barrier there. Our business model is obviously built on being able to service hopefully multiple parties within a given area. It's hard to make money on just one single route, but if you've got a number of different facilities that can move things within that region or that community, it starts to make a lot of sense. And so I think at the end of the day, the routes are independent, but they might be part of a bigger network, and that network will have a lot of different variables to how it's supported. But I think from when you boil it all down, it's going to come back to being able to prove that things are reliable over time. And so time is going to be the biggest factor.
Guys, in some ways, this has been like the ultimate tease. You've been talking around such a terrific use case for Spright. So if you could, tell us a little bit about Spright, the company, sure. And also, the area of, Luca, of medical and lab logistics has come through in a lot of our podcasts. And Justin, you were saying you were a big fan of the podcast. Thank you. But that's really come out in the last couple of months of the podcast. And here we have a recording with you at Spright, where medical and lab logistics is at the core of what you are and what you do. So if you could just tell us a little bit about why you're there, why you're in that space, why did Air Methods think it was an interesting area, and where you see this opportunity going for the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, there's always the perfect storm that makes everything work and function the way that you want it to. So, so much of technology and innovation is before its time, and that's always the saddest thing to watch. I think when you look at medical delivery, and we certainly went through this in the very beginning, we started with the hospitals, right? And the hospitals are an interesting customer because a hospital really wants to move a lot of different things. So they may want to move a bag of blood or one blood sample, or they might want to move a whole prosthetic. And so you end up with a size and weight and volume problem really quickly. And to really get the volume of flights needed for that hospital, you end up needing multiple drones to service kind of multiple use cases. And that's where the economics start falling apart. It's not to say we won't get there, because I believe we will. And certainly we've got strategies to be able to solve that. But when you kind of boil down the logistics of any kind of medical network, at the end of the day, there are things that move every day, and lab samples are a good example of this. Pharmacy is a good example of this. These things move around all day long. They're done with ground couriers. Ground couriers aren't always cheap. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But you've got basically a ground vehicle car that's moving something that's relatively small. It's standard in size. And when you look at labs specifically, the great thing about labs is that the way that a lab is measured is on turnaround time. So you have a lot of great alignment in terms of, the functional carrying of something like lab samples, as well as, what the KPI is both for the lab customer, the hospital, and our business, which would be time. And so you can imagine that with a lab, they're driving around with a car, picking up samples from a number of facilities and bringing those back. They probably do that at the end of the day, whereas we could do it in an on-demand way and get those results back very quickly. And so what we saw in a lot of rural communities, and you guys probably saw the video in Hutchinson, is that, people in rural America could be sitting in the hospital just waiting on lab results for a long time. And so it may take 24 hours to turn around the first set of data and another 24 because they got to run more tests. And you can imagine being in the hospital for 2 days, just literally waiting on results. And so if you look at, the good that you can do with this and the access to care and the quality of care that we're really trying to provide, being able to improve turnaround time is really what produces an outcome and a better level of care for that person. Typically, if you're going to get your blood drawn, right, so you fast all night. In the morning, you go and do it as early as you can because you're hungry and you want to eat. Right. And it sits there all day for the most part. It doesn't always sit there. There's certainly stat tests and other things. And if the hospital's got its own lab, they might run it internally. But in a lot of cases, it does sit there all day and it gets picked up at the end of the day. And this is especially pronounced in the rural communities where you could be just sitting there days waiting for it to be picked up to go get run. Once it's run, it's very quick. So, we've got, different customers and partnerships where, we might be able to take 24 hours down to 2. And to us, that's a huge advantage to that community.
And so considering the mission requirements for the medical use case, how difficult was it to find an unmanned system, a drone, that addresses these requirements satisfactorily?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really hard. That's the firm answer. It is very difficult to come up with all the right pieces to make this work. So, we see a lot of really great medical use cases in places like Africa and other areas where, they've just got really easy places to fly. And the difference between that use case and doing this in a semi-urban environment is really hard. So you have to consider a lot more things. You have to consider where it's going to land, what it's going to land on, how you're going to standardize that, how it's going to land, how it's even going to hit that landing spot every time and not endanger anybody around it. You have to consider the package, how it's going to keep lab samples cool or cold. There's different levels of requirement for that. You have to consider the chain of custody, right? So I'm taking something and I'm moving it. So I'm now a part of that supply chain. I've got my own chain of custody requirements. And so there's software involved in that. And so we've got, not just a drone, but we've got landing systems on the drone. We've got safety systems on the drone. We've got systems that are managing the temperature of those specimens. We've got docking stations that they land on that robotically take the samples off the drone. I think one thing that's often overlooked is just basically the interaction of the people on the ground with the aircraft. So I don't necessarily want everybody grabbing the aircraft and manipulating it or having to take something out of it. That's how things break pretty quickly. So what we really want is this all to be as robotic as possible. So the person should interact with whatever the package is taken out and put in. So our landing docking stations remove the package and put them in a storage locker, and they're able to access that from our application and open up and get their package out. And so there's a lot of considerations that go into really making this functional and scalable. And if you can have all those pieces that I just described, then you can start really putting together something that scales.
Given the fact that this is a near-term market opportunity and a quite sizable one, are you surprised that there are no more robust offerings in the market when it comes to vehicles themselves?
It's a good question. I think the hard thing with this is that there's just there's not enough operators. I kind of mentioned that earlier on. There's not enough people doing it. And so when you're looking at even from an investor perspective, investing in a company that's going to build, an amazing aircraft to support that particular medical community, you really kind of have to next look at how many operators are there that are doing it and how many, different customers could you possibly have. And I don't think there's enough of that. And I think that's going to be a hard problem to solve for a while. So I think we've seen an uptick in it over the last year or so. We've seen a lot more people come into the market, which we're really excited about. But at the end of the day, I think that's the biggest thing holding it back, because it's not cheap to build an aircraft. It's hard.
But even if you zoom out away from the medical delivery use case, but all the other commercial drone use cases, the common feedback from the end users and operators that these vehicles are still not easy enough to work, not integrated enough into existing enterprise workflows, not reliable or configurable enough. Would you agree with this, generalized assessment? And again, given that there's so many competent teams and so much investment capital going into the market, why are we seeing these gaps?
Yeah, I'd 100% agree with you. I think that those are real challenges. We've certainly been challenged by that over the years. Being able to configure something is really important. And I think that's one of the biggest issues when people are building drones. I mean, if you look at Boeing, like let's take a traditional aviation example, every 737 that goes to a different customer has a different configuration. It could be everything from avionics to seats to the galleys to anything. It's got a lot of different configurations. Most drone companies haven't approached it that way. So most drone companies have built one drone that they're hoping serves several markets. And if I get a drone, I've got to change pretty much everything about it to make it work within our network and all the systems that we need to integrate it with. They're not set up and designed to support that. They don't have different configuration management groups and staffing to be able to do that. So I think that's the biggest gap, is that most people are kind of building a drone hoping that the community wants it the way that it is, and they end up locking it down to the point where we can't use it.
To maybe go a layer deeper, there's probably some design debt or technical debt in the way that these vehicles are architected to begin with that lead to the situation that you're describing. But at the same time, the market potential should be enough of a motivation to re-engineer the vehicles to the point where it really addresses the customer demands more appropriately.
I think if you look at, as an example, something like a flight controller, right? So you've got a system that's designed to control the aircraft, and that system is probably built on an open source standard, and that's fine. And that's one way to do it. That system, in a lot of cases, is designed for that aircraft. And so what ends up happening especially with the financing and the capital that the manufacturers are raising, is that there's an opportunity to take this open source flight control software and kind of cordon it off and make it my own unique version of it. And that's got IP attached to it. And as these manufacturers are creating the aircraft, they're also trying to create IP, and they're trying to create value for their shareholders. And when you do that, you end up locking it down. And once it's locked down, that's where you start having the issues with integrating a lot of these different systems. And that's where it becomes a really heavy lift for those companies to transition from what they have today to something that would be usable for a company like Spright, and being able to make it so we can use hundreds of them. So I don't disagree that the opportunity is sitting there. I think that the challenge is really more in the corporate structure, the IP strategy that company has, and their ability to manage change. Because at the end of the day, even when you get past just making a configuration change so that I can use a new piece of hardware on the aircraft which serves my purpose, you still have, from a regulatory perspective, the requirement to manage that process. So you've got, DO 178, and you've got the ability to be able to track changes and make sure that you've tested that and validated that and pushed it out the right way. And I think that becomes a really heavy lift to typically an understaffed manufacturing facility.
So Justin, the Hutchinson Regional Medical System, let's dive into that a little bit. And it's interesting, your comment about, where the competitors and where the opportunities. So what are they doing today before you came aboard? What were they doing today, let's say, with their medical supplies, medical labs? What did it cost them? And then introduce Spright. What's the value you offered? What's the value proposition to them? What's the cost to them difference between what they were doing before and what you're offering through Spright?
Yeah, so Hutchinson's got kind of an interesting problem, which is really not that unique when it comes to a lot of rural facilities. So Hutchinson Medical Center is kind of a centrally located hospital in that region. There's a number of clinics that are within about 20 to 25 miles from Hutchinson. And what ends up happening is most of the supplies and most of the medications and blood and everything goes and starts from Hutchinson itself. There are other facilities that are 20 miles away that don't have access to some of this stuff. And so if they need it, they usually take somebody off the floor. They'll take a nurse, and that nurse drives down and picks up that medication or that bag of blood or whatever it is that they need, and then drives it back up. Or in some cases where it's more of a planned situation. So, for example, if they are delivering a baby in one of these outside clinic facilities, they may just not deliver that baby because they don't have enough blood to support any kind of issues that might happen. And so they go ahead and push that person down into the larger hospital system. And so the real value driver here is that if you can more efficiently use the drone to transport that series of goods from the Hutchinson Hospital up to the clinic, they can now serve that community much better up there. And they don't have to have huge inventories of things that they probably don't need big inventories of. They don't have to take people off the floor to go and drive it. And although it's a 20-minute flight for us, it's a 60-minute drive. It's a long drive to be able to get it down there because they're talking about 2-lane country roads and lots of dirt roads and things in between. So it's a much more efficient way to do it, and it extends service and extends the healthcare out to some of those facilities, which is fantastic for the community.
And Justin, even compared to, let's say, somebody set up a road courier service, providing the same capabilities, what's the value over a car-driven courier service?
I think the biggest value is still time, right? So as I mentioned, the road infrastructure is not great, and so being able to drive it is still expensive. So, it's I think one of the things that separates what we're doing is that, we're very bidirectional. So you might be able to go and drop something off and pick something up and bring it back. And, you're serving both sides of that flight path at that point, which is really essential. When you're talking about a courier, normally it's a one-way trip and that's all they're doing. And, they blend that into a much larger supply chain model of serving a number of people. I think the hardest thing for couriers in that type of community is that they are few and far between, mainly because outside of Hutchinson for, probably hundreds of miles, there's not much out there. So it's not like going into a big urban environment where, there's lots of suburbs and cities around the main city. And, if I only have X number of trips for this one hospital, I can pick up a lot more outside. You can't do that because there's nothing close. And so that becomes a big barrier to being able to support this with the courier infrastructure, which why today they use the nurses on the floor to go and make those trips.
A year from now, let's say your revenue is 10 times higher than what it is today. What's the ideal customer for your service that would allow you to be able to grow that fast?
I think the ideal customer for us is somebody who's got multiple facilities. We often operate in kind of a hub and spoke network, and the more spokes, the better. And then it's an area where we can tag on other use cases. So although we might start with lab, we can extend that to pharmacy and so on and so forth. So an ideal customer really has a geography that makes sense for this, that currently has a problem. I see kind of the rural community being really a great target audience for what we're doing. We've got operations and things that we're working on up in Eastern Oregon, which are very similar, where you've got, again, a community of people where they're reliant on things moving and they move on the ground right now. But we talk about, one lab that has 100 pickup sites. And so there's a large scale to being able to start doing that by drone. And in most cases, being able to turn those samples around faster is really positive for that community, and it reduces the carbon footprint, and it has a huge green effect.
Is it easy to quantify the value proposition? Certainly it is easy to talk about this on a qualitative basis, but when you talk to the customers, is there a very clear business case?
The business case is pretty clear. I mean, generally speaking, the economics get down to what they're doing today, and hopefully will be better over time. And, obviously time is the biggest factor that they're after. So if we can improve time and we can keep the cost to what they're used to seeing, that's the goal that everybody's after.
I see. And what were those initial conversations with Hutchinson's and the likes when you first started talking about drones? What was the initial reaction?
The initial reaction, I can say actually globally, is incredibly positive. Everybody really wants the technology and they really want it tomorrow. So generally speaking, we're having to throttle expectations and make sure people understand that there's a regulatory process and we've got some work to do, but that we're equally as excited to get things going. I think that there's been a pretty substantial shift in how healthcare facilities manage things like this. So, traditionally, they're looking for people to drive things around and been a shortage of staff to be able to complete those drives and to do it in a way that is both reliable and economical. So they've struggled with that. There's a lot of global initiatives, including in the US, where a lot of these fleet vehicles are being pushed towards being able to be electric and be a lot less impactful on the environment. So the drone, we just finished a case study up in Oregon, as I mentioned, with the Department of Energy and the Idaho National Labs. And the drone's about 95% better on the carbon footprint than a ground vehicle, which isn't necessarily surprising. But when that's something you're being measured against, it becomes a very valuable tool.
But the hospital doesn't care about environmental impact. They're just trying to find a way to lower their costs and ideally improve the quality of care, I would assume.
Exactly. Yeah, quality of care and the outcome of that care is really what they're after. And we tend to have an impact on that.
So we talked about the vehicle a lot. What other pieces of this overall system are important to maybe discuss here?
Yeah, this was a fun part of kind of building this out. So obviously, the drone has to land somewhere, and landing on the ground has a ton of kind of added risks to it. There are certain facilities where they have abandoned helicopter pads or things like that we might be able to leverage. But for the most part, we kind of want to assume that people have nothing that we can use. And so we had to build landing stations that we call the nest that the drone lands on. Being able to land on those is obviously complicated, and we have amazing technology partners that have helped us with that problem. But landing on the nest and having the nest is a key part of our puzzle. And then there's really just the interaction with the system and the service, right? So at the end of the day, if you look at the number of steps it takes for me to take a package, hand it to a courier, and have it go on its merry way, it's not many. And so if the drone is now 12 new steps, people just won't use it and they won't adopt it. So we had to take a really hard look at, okay, how do we really want customers to interact with this? What does that mean to interact with it? How do they know that it's coming? How do we have full chain of custody of the package? And so we've built out a service called Spright Flight, which is an application where they can request the drone, they can see the drone in flight, they know what's in it, they know what's coming and when it's going to be there to help strengthen that coordination. So, we learned pretty quickly that although we can talk the talk and have all the aviation know-how, most people who are using this are not aviation people. And so, we needed to have an application that was very customer centric and didn't have a lot of aviation stuff in it and was really focused on the service that we were providing. So we've built Spright Flight, we've built the ground infrastructure needed to support that. And then there's a lot of subsystems that go on the aircraft itself to be able to land on that infrastructure. So you can imagine all of the edge cases about, what if the surface is wet? Can the camera still see it? What if you've got snow? What if it's really windy? So it lands on top of an 8-foot docking station and the wind gusts, does it blow the drone off the top or not? So we had to really engineer a lot of really clever solutions to a lot of those problems.
What were some of the interesting and unexpected insights as you were going through this process, both for the components and the Spright Flight and the nests?
I think one of the hardest things that we've faced is that no two customers seem to be the same. They operate differently, their metrics are different, their software and systems are different. If you take something, for example, like being able to carry specimens in a drone, that's regulated really at a state level. So the validation process is different state to state to state. And so I think we probably assumed that most labs all operated very similarly. I mean, it's a pretty commoditized business at the end of the day. So you would assume that there's a lot of consistency between those operations, but there really isn't. And especially when you start going global and looking worldwide, they even get more nuanced as you go further out. So I think that was probably one of the first things that we ran into.
Interesting.
I think the other thing is, there's certainly a lot of excitement around different things a drone can carry. And as you kind of go down those rabbit holes, you find that a lot of those just really aren't feasible or functional. I think organ is another one. So, moving organs around sounds like it makes a lot of sense. And as we really kind of ventured down that road, I think we're a ways out from doing that, mainly because it's heavy, it needs to go a long distance, and it's not going to happen with the 55-pound drone. It's going to have to be something much bigger that can really accommodate a much further flight.
When you mentioned that there's no two customers that are the same in terms of rules governing the transport or any other aspects of their operations and their software and their processes, how do you then build your business to the point where it does not end up being a custom solution for every customer?
Yeah, I think this is basic product management at the end of the day, right? So we're looking at where the similarities are, where the differences are, and how we accommodate those. I think a great example of this, from a much higher level is if you look at how to operate in different countries. We knew that when we were building our operational platform and our operations center to be able to manage these drones, that we'd have to account for different rule sets and different requirements from the country and probably different software and tools, right? So UTM is a great example of every country's kind of got, except for the US, its own UTM that they want you to use. And so when you're building the construct of how we're going to manage this from a remote facility, you just kind of leave that pocket open. And you know that we're going to go to country A and we're going to use their UTM and it plugs in here and this is how we plug into it. And I think that same methodology can be used across the organization and has successfully been used across the organization to date, where we know there's going to be nuances now, we know where they are, so we can build a common platform that's got kind of ready-made plugins and APIs for the areas where we know we're going to have to deal with that.
Speaking of UTM, what's the state of the art there and what's the role of startups?
It's such a great question. So I came from the UTM space. I was working on this problem a long time ago, even when it was a DoD problem. And I, as an operator, have such a different view on it today than I did in the past. But I think, UTM does have a role. I think it serves a tremendous purpose if it's applied correctly. So there's great examples around the world where, UTM has been very successful. One would be Poland. We spent some time in Poland looking at some operations there. And, they've got a countrywide UTM and you can do BVLOS and everybody has ADS-B out and in and everybody goes and flies. And they do 550,000 flights a year, something about that. So it's a very successful program because everybody has the same tool that they're using. There are other countries like the US where it really just hasn't taken off the right way. And I think, the post-NASA transition to the FAA hasn't been great. And we're still trying to figure out where UTM actually fits. My advice to the UTM side of this is if you really look at really where we are, I think a lot of people get worked up and excited about tactical deconfliction and some of these really challenging problems to solve. When at the end of the day, what I'm really stuck with is I know I've got to build a waiver. I know I've got to make a safety case. And does your system have all the data sets in it that will help me do that? Can you create value there? Because it takes a lot of time to go and pull a bunch of different maps and to put them together and to show that, where all the bodies are buried. So being able to just get those core data sets seems to be still a pretty large gap in the UTM world.
You mentioned also DAA as one of the big roadblocks. Can you comment on that a little bit? What's your current perspective on it? How is the industry successfully or not successfully going about solving it?
It's a really hard problem to solve. I think every country's looked at this just a little bit different. One thing that we did do is we flew literally around the world a bunch to look at all the best technologies. And so all the subsystems that we've put on the aircraft have really come from best of breed manufacturers from all over the world. And we're very, very pleased with all the things that we've selected. DAA, we've seen it all, is still really a hard problem to solve. And I think the problem is that everybody's still trying to find a silver bullet. So There really isn't one, and you can poke holes in just about everything, and that's going to be kind of a continual issue for some time. I think there are some very promising systems out there. I think that what you're going to probably find at the end of the day is it's going to be more of a sensor fusion problem. So you're going to need, radar and EOIR cameras and some other tools to be able to blend that stuff together to make it function correctly. But we're still a long ways off from, size, weight, power, and price being to the point where I can put it on a 55-pound drone and fly it in the airspace. So, I think the right way for everybody to look at this is that it's going to be a layered approach, and most people know that. You're going to have different mitigations in place that meet that operational environment's needs, and that's going to be how it's going to be for some time.
The area of medical delivery is still one that fascinates me, and a lot of our guests, again, have said if there are large rivers of cash out there where there's a lot of economic value, this is one of them. Ballpark, what do you think is the size of the market, realizable market for medical drone delivery just here in the United States?
Oh, you're going to put me on the spot. It's definitely a multi-billion-dollar market. It depends on kind of where it starts and where it stops, right? So
right.
I think the challenging thing about drones is that, again, just like certification and everything else, it comes down to the use case and the con ops and what you're going to do with it and where and why. And I can tell you from our kind of growth perspective, certainly we're starting with these smaller drones that are below 55 pounds, but it's not where we intend to stop. We've got, and we've made announcements on aircraft that we've invested in that are much bigger and go much further. And when you can start, showing different layers of the network, obviously that market value goes up exponentially. So it's much more, I'll say, lucrative when you can move 200 miles as opposed to 20.
And those multi-billion-dollar market, who's doing that service today? What service is being taken away from by the drones providing this capability?
You're not making me make a lot of friends on this, huh? So I think there's a lot of people. I mean, honestly, it's across the board. I think one of the biggest challenges that healthcare faces is the supply chain problem. So just about every facility relies on, I would say, a half a dozen different groups to be able to support this. So they may do everything from FedEx and UPS all the way down to it's urgent, call a taxi and just throw it in a taxi.
So it's essentially the courier services, whether it be a courier being the FedEx or whether it be the local courier. Okay. And I know these are enormous costs for hospitals or the labs. All right, let me ask you another one. If somebody's going to dominate this space, let's say it's Spright, what's going to be the core capability of that organization that it's going to allow them to be able to dominate? Is it because they know courier well, labs? Is it somebody who knows the drone space really well, drone delivery? Is it a software company? Is it somebody who knows UTM? What's going to be the core strength of that organization?
I think sadly it's going to be somebody who knows aviation. So I say this all the time on different interviews. If I had 200 or 300 drones right now that I could fly, they'd all be flying. There's enough business out there to support flying this stuff at scale today. It's being able to understand how aviation operates, how it works, and being able to get them into that point where you can do BVLOS at a scalable level. And I think this is where, tech companies in particular have really struggled. So I think we've made really good strides and headway into, the places that are going to enable us to be able to do this at scale. And it's only because we've got a whole company full of people who've come from different aviation backgrounds and can apply methodologies to help move this forward.
Well, I think that's an answer our listeners would want to hear, right? I think you're saying there's a multi-billion-dollar opportunity, and the biggest differentiator, the biggest missing component is the knowledge, is the aviation knowledge.
It is. I mean, and there's a whole part of our business to support this. I mean, we found pretty quickly in the beginning that, there was lots of great companies and great technology, and they really just needed somebody to help kind of guide them through that, whether it was writing manuals or helping them support, documentation and testing. And so we have a whole certification engineering group that really just does that as a service. And I think that, hopefully there's others that branch into that, because getting this technology to a place where aviation expects it is going to be really the next level of maturity, in my opinion.
Justin, can we talk about the type certification process a little bit? What it is, what it entails, what's the latest on it? And then beyond type certification, what are the approvals that you need to run the business?
Yeah, so the type certification process is designed to certify the aircraft. Obviously, it's it's a fairly complex process these days. You've got the aircraft, and you've got the associated elements, and you've got the operator who's involved in the whole process, and 135 certificate and some other pieces. But essentially, at its core, it's looking at what the use case is. It's defining what needs to be certified and why, how you're going to operate in that environment. And then it's proving that you've got a good design for that aircraft and the right systems and approaches to be able to operate that. So it's a DNR focused process. It's focused on proving that the system is reliable and could be used in the environment that you've depicted in the beginning. And then, the second half of this really falls on the operator of, how do you intend to use this system? What other systems are you adding to it? I mentioned a bunch of other pieces that we're building that kind of come into play when it comes to remote operations or one-to-many, or what we're landing on, or how we're controlling the aircraft remotely. All of these associated elements or other pieces of the puzzle that have to be looked at and evaluated and signed off as, we're okay with you guys doing this.
What works well? What doesn't work well with the process itself?
I think what works well is starting small. I think the crawl, walk, run is the right approach, and will be for some time. I think people who shoot the moon too quickly are really going to get a lot of pushback. It's not how the regulators want to see it. They want to see it kind of start here, and we'll add to it over time. So I think the goal is to get as quickly as possible, get a configuration nailed down. This is what the aircraft's going to be. It's going to have these pieces. These pieces of wire will be this length. They'll plug in here. Once you've got a set configuration, you can move forward through the process pretty quick. But I think people struggle with that config at the very beginning because, again, they're not trying to tailor the aircraft to one market. They're hoping they can have multiple markets. And so finding one configuration to meet multiple markets is not always simple. But that would be the biggest piece of advice I've had, is to get that configuration knocked down as fast as you can.
And the reason people go through the type cert process is to ultimately be able to fly beyond visual line of sight or over people, as we discussed offline before the podcast. Is the type cert process tailored to this end goal appropriately?
It is. I mean, again, this is kind of legacy aviation, right? So, we're a 135 operator. I've got an active Part 135 certificate. It's got a helicopter on it. I want to put drones on it. In order to do that, I have to have a type certified aircraft. So it's really the only mechanism to date to be able to move the aircraft from experimental over onto an active aircraft that we're flying with. So that's the reason we're doing it is obviously we intend to move goods as a service, and that requires a 135. And be able to use the 135, you got to have a T-seat aircraft.
We should schedule another session just to talk about this process because it is a very interesting one, and unfortunately we ran out of time to go deeper in it, but would be a great discussion for a future podcast.
Absolutely. No, I'd love to do it.
Okay, Justin, so if you fast forward 5 years, 10 years, what does the drone industry look like?
I think it's going to look a lot more like traditional aviation. I think you're going to have a lot more mature companies in the space that come from aviation backgrounds. I think you need that kind of adoption. I think that's what the industry really needs is people who've come from the legacy space that see the opportunity and understand how aviation systems work to be able to put this into practice. I think you're going to see a lot more maturity in the parts and the components and the strategies people are taking to get those different pieces to market. And hopefully, the supply chain straightens itself out a little bit and you've got better access to the right, pieces and the right parts. I definitely think, kind of as a last aside, there'll be a lot of consolidation over the next 5 or 10 years. There's a lot of companies that, you can start merging together and having a really interesting offering of services or technologies. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that consolidation that hopefully comes with the maturity of some of the aviation background needed to move that stuff forward.
How many drone manufacturers or brand do you think the market will ultimately settle on? Will it resemble the auto industry or the aviation industry?
I think, unfortunately, it's gonna resemble the auto industry for the aviation industry for a while. I think it's going to be small, just because it is a capital intensive process to get things to that scale that's needed. And I don't know how. I think the investors. A lot of people have lost money at this point with some of the early drones, some of the early technologies. There's kind of a new drone every year is how it feels sometimes. So I think until people really get to that level of maturity where they can, start producing these at scale. I think Elon always said it best, having a a prototype is really easy. It's an order of magnitude more complex to put it into production. I think once we start seeing good production happening, then you'll start to see it, sliding towards the automobile industry. But I see it as a crawl, walk, run.
And the leaders, let's say 5 years from now, the top 3 leaders in medical delivery, their core capability will they be drone companies that happen to have a branch that's medical delivery? Or will it be companies that are known for medical delivery and they get their drones? The drone is a commodity.
Yeah, personally, I imagine that this is a multimodal approach, right? So I imagine it's going to have different facets to it, and the drone might be a part of a bigger puzzle. That would be, if I had a crystal ball, what I would probably envision in that is that it won't just be drones, but it might be drones and a combination of other ground-based technologies or other aviation assets to be able to build out that network. But hopefully all 3 of those companies are all Spright companies at some point in time.
What advice would you give to someone who wants to start a business in the drone space?
I would say make sure you understand really what the regulatory hurdles are. I think a lot of people get excited about building the tech, and the manufacturing seems relatively straightforward. Composites aren't hard to do. Electronics aren't very complicated. But, when you really want to take that to a certified level, which, although we've been kind of dogging the FAA. EASA, when you get to the higher sale levels, still requires, a type cert. So you're still going to have to go down that road at some point in time. It just requires a lot of forethought in terms of how you design that aircraft, where you get your parts from, how you're going to prove reliability along the way. If you don't have any experience in that, leverage the different resources that are out there to get that, because otherwise you end up going down a very expensive path for a long time.
What advice would you give to somebody who's starting a business in medical air delivery?
Call us. We should work together.
Okay,
great.
And honestly, on that topic, one of the things, and I've said this for years now, there wasn't enough people working together in this space. It's been a problem for a long time. So early on, everybody was going to do it all. They were going to build every piece of everything, and that was going to be how it was. And it was really an unfortunate approach, because I think if there would be more collaboration, it would be much easier to see the light at the end of the tunnel. So, we only have to do the things we have to do. So, there's plenty of gaps in the technology that we're looking at, and either we'll build it ourselves or we'll find a great partner that does it with us. But I would say hopefully people continue to collaborate and do a lot more collaboration. That's a really needed piece of the puzzle.
What's the most common misconception or misunderstanding in this area, whether it be the drone or the medical air delivery?
I think people still think it's easy. I think that's still a problem. If the regulators would just help us, we can get there.
Right.
I don't think it's quite that simple. I think there's still a lot of reliability to be proven to get to that point. So it's just not quite as simple as it sounds, and going the right route is hard, right? It's like, we've had to do a lot of information security stuff on the utility front, and we've had to do a lot of cybersecurity stuff on the operations side. And, they're cumbersome processes. They require a lot of documentation and internal cultural changes at the company. And I think it's hard for people to grasp the order of magnitude complexity it is to instill that across an organization. So I think it's still just harder than people think.
And my guess is if you were going to leave one point with our audience, that would be the point as well, wouldn't it?
It would be probably, yeah. But again, I think the future is really bright. There's big markets out there, not just in medical, where this can really make a dent in the world and change the way that we look at things. And we're excited about it, and we hope that people continue to work with us and with each other to get the industry there. I think it's got an exciting future ahead.
Well, that's a nice way to break. So thank you very much, Justin. You've been very generous with your time and insights. So thanks for the conversation. We look forward to having you back again, and all the best to you.
Yeah, likewise. I appreciate the opportunity, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right, that's a wrap for today. Thank you for listening to the Vertical Space Podcast. Reach out if there are topics that you would like us to discuss, and goodbye until the next episode. Unless mentioned, this podcast is in no way endorsing or promoting any person and or company mentioned, and all opinions within the podcast are solely that of the presenters. The Vertical Space makes no guarantees, warranty, or representation of any information given in this podcast. Any information given is for informational purposes and should be used at your own risk. This podcast is for general, educational, and entertainment purposes only.